You keep calling it attachment. But a lot of what people call attachment is not emotional excess. It is internal agreement. Something in you is still cooperating with the pattern. Not openly, not consciously, not in a way that feels deliberate. But beneath the frustration, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the part of you that says you want out, there is still a piece of your mind that says, this makes sense. That is why certain things do not leave when you understand them. Insight is not always enough to break a pattern, because patterns are not built on information alone. They are built on logic. Not logical in the clean, conscious, verbal way people imagine. Logical in the older way, the survival way, the emotional way, the repeated way. At some point, your mind learned that holding on did something for you. Maybe it kept a connection alive. Maybe it preserved hope. Maybe it protected you from admitting what something really was. Maybe it made pain feel organized. And once the mind assigns a function to something, it rarely drops it just because it hurts. Pain is not always a reason to stop. Sometimes pain is interpreted as proof. Proof that it mattered, proof that it was real, proof that it should not be abandoned too quickly. So the mind keeps returning, not because it enjoys suffering, but because suffering still feels connected to meaning. That is the part people miss when they ask why they cannot let go. They assume the mind is trapped by emotion. But very often, it is held in place by interpretation, by the private conclusion that says, if I stop caring, maybe it meant nothing. If I stop revisiting it, maybe I lose the lesson. If I stop reaching for it, maybe I have to face what was never coming back. And for the mind, that can feel more threatening than the pattern itself. So it does the only thing it knows how to do. It keeps the pattern alive. It rehearses it, reframes it, returns to it, defends it. Sometimes it even calls this healing, not because it is lying to you, but because from the inside repetition can feel responsible. It can feel like vigilance. It can feel like loyalty. It can feel like emotional intelligence. When really, it is just an old rule still running. That is why letting go feels unnatural before it feels relieving. Because you are not only losing the thing, you are losing the logic that kept the thing in place. And when that logic has been with you long enough, it starts to feel like identity, like character, like depth, like proof of who you are. So when someone tells you to just move on, the mind does not hear freedom. It hears contradiction. It hears, become someone who no longer makes sense to yourself. That is why force does not work here. You cannot rip yourself away from a pattern your mind still considers reasonable. You can suppress it. You can distract from it. You can perform distance from it. But underneath all of that, the rule is still intact. And if the rule is still intact, the pattern is still alive, even in silence, even in distance, even after time has passed. Because time does not dissolve what still feels true. It only buries it until something familiar touches it again. The mind doesn't update itself just because time passes. It updates when something stops working the way it used to. And until then, it keeps running the same rule. That's the part that makes this confusing. Because on the surface, you've changed. You see things differently. You understand more. You recognize patterns you didn't see before. But recognition doesn't automatically replace logic. You can see something clearly and still operate as if it's true, because the rule underneath hasn't been challenged. At some point, your mind built a quiet equation. If I hold on, then something stays. If I revisit, then something remains. If I don't let go, something isn't lost. Not literally, but emotionally. And once that equation is formed, it doesn't get erased just because the outcome hurts. The mind doesn't measure truth by comfort. It measures it by consistency. What has been repeated enough starts to feel correct, even if it's outdated. So you end up in this strange position where part of you knows something is no longer right, but another part is still operating as if it is. And that split creates tension, not because you're confused, but because you're running two interpretations at once. The newer one sees clearly. The older one still decides. That's why you can tell yourself, "This doesn't make sense anymore," and still feel pulled back into it. Because the pull is not coming from your current understanding. It's coming from an older conclusion that hasn't been replaced. And the mind doesn't abandon conclusions easily, especially the ones that once protected you, or preserved something you didn't want to lose. To the mind, letting go is not neutral. It implies that something was unnecessary, or misread, or overvalued, or never what it seemed. And that can feel destabilizing, because now the mind has to face a different question. If this was never what I thought it was, then what was I holding on to? And more importantly, what does that say about me? So instead of updating the rule, the mind reinforces it. It looks for reasons to keep it intact. It reframes the past. It softens the contradictions. It highlights what supports the original belief. And it ignores what doesn't. Not because it's trying to deceive you, but because it's trying to stay coherent. The mind values internal consistency more than accuracy, because consistency feels stable. So as long as the pattern can still be explained, it can still be justified. And as long as it can be justified, it can still be repeated. That's why you don't feel like you're choosing it, because you're not choosing the pattern directly. You're following the logic behind it, quietly, automatically, without needing to think about it, the same way you follow any rule you believe in. And until that logic is questioned, the pattern doesn't need to change. Because from the inside, it still makes sense. If this helped you notice something about your own mind, consider liking the video and subscribing. More of this is coming. You're not just holding on to the pattern, you're agreeing with it. Quietly, not in a way you would admit out loud, not in a way that feels intentional, but in a way that keeps it active. Because every pattern carries a point of view, a way of interpreting what happened, what it meant, what it says about you, what it says about them. And most of that interpretation goes unquestioned. It just becomes the default. So instead of asking whether the pattern is true, the mind starts from the assumption that it is, and builds everything around it. That's where the agreement sits, underneath the reaction, underneath the emotion. There's a belief that hasn't been examined, something like, "This mattered more than it should have. This meant something permanent. This says something about me." And once that belief settles in, the pattern doesn't need effort to continue. It sustains itself. Because now every return to it feels justified, even necessary. You replay it because it still feels unresolved. You revisit it because it still feels important. You hold on to it because it still feels accurate, not objectively, but internally. And the mind prioritizes internal accuracy over external reality, because internal accuracy feels stable. It gives the experience structure. It gives the feeling a place to sit. So instead of asking, Is this still true? The mind keeps asking, how can I make this make sense again? That's why you don't feel like you're choosing it, because it doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like consistency, like staying aligned with something you've already accepted, even if you don't remember accepting it. And the more consistent you are with a belief, the more invisible it becomes. It stops feeling like a belief. It starts feeling like reality. So when something challenges it, it doesn't feel like correction. It feels like disruption. That's why letting go feels wrong before it feels right. Because letting go isn't just releasing the pattern. It's contradicting the belief that holds it in place. And contradiction creates friction. It creates hesitation. It creates that feeling of, this doesn't sit right, even if you can't explain why. Because somewhere underneath, you're still aligned with the original interpretation. You're still agreeing with what it meant. You're still carrying the conclusion forward. And until that agreement is seen, it can't be interrupted. Because you don't break patterns you disagree with. You break patterns you no longer believe. And belief doesn't disappear because you want it to. It disappears when it stops making sense from the inside. Letting go doesn't start with effort. It starts when something stops making sense. Not intellectually, internally. That's the shift people wait for without realizing it. They think letting go is something they do, something they force, something they decide. But the mind doesn't release what still feels valid. It releases what no longer holds structure, what no longer explains itself. That's why forcing distance rarely works. You can step away physically, but the pattern doesn't live in proximity. It lives in interpretation. So even when you remove the person, the situation, the environment, the pattern stays intact, because the meaning is still intact. And meaning is what holds everything in place. The mind isn't attached to the event. It's attached to what the event represents, what it confirmed, what it implied, what it allowed you to believe about them, about yourself, about how things work. So letting go isn't about removing the memory. It's about the memory losing its explanation, losing the structure that made it feel necessary. And that doesn't happen on command. It happens when the mind can no longer justify the pattern, when the old logic starts to feel incomplete, when the explanation begins to collapse on its own. Not all at once, but quietly. You start noticing inconsistencies, things that don't align anymore, parts of the story that don't hold the same weight, and the pattern begins to loosen. Not because you forced it, but because it no longer fits cleanly. That's when distance starts to feel natural, not like loss, but like release. Because now you're not contradicting yourself. You're aligning with something new, a different interpretation, a different conclusion. And once that new conclusion stabilizes, the old one doesn't need to be fought anymore. It just stops being used. That's what letting go actually is. Not removal, not force, but the quiet absence of a reason to stay. No resistance, no effort, no attachment to maintaining it. Just a shift in what makes sense from the inside. And once that happens, the pattern doesn't need to be broken. It becomes irrelevant. That's when it ends. Not because you let go, but because there's nothing left to hold. Subscribe for more clarity like this.